Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough News.
You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. As always, I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, it's a pleasure to be here alongside of you.
Same. It's always a pleasure to be alongside you, Eugene. I'm so excited because we have an awesome show.
We do. I'd say the pleasure is all mine, but you know, there's some consternation in the chat last week that I don't allow others pleasure by taking the pleasure every time. I don't really know exactly why people are upset that I'm happy for people to be on. It is my pleasure to be your co-host and to be able to have all these excellent people to interview, but nevertheless, I cede to the masses and I will try to allow others to let the pleasure be theirs to be here.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Take the pleasure.
Well, you are definitely right, Rania. We have a great show here, as we always do. Plenty of things coming up. One really exciting thing, as people may have seen on social media, the Socialist Program, which is a fantastic podcast, is now adding a video element that will be part of our lineup here on Breakthrough News. So we'll have Brian Becker talking about Socialist Program. We'll also be talking about some of the shenanigans going on in Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking about the climate catastrophe happening right now on the cusp of COP26. Is that alliteration? How'd I do there, Rania? Nevertheless, we are going to be talking again to the great Brandon Wu. Very happy to have him back. We're also going to be chatting about the upcoming elections in Honduras, not being covered a lot in the United States, very important for Central and Latin America. And we're also going to be discussing just even more ridiculous behavior by the apartheid regime in Israel. So as Rania mentioned, we've got plenty of great stuff for you queued up here on the Freedom Side Live this week on Breakthrough News. And just want to take this moment to remind you, if you're watching on YouTube, to make sure you subscribe and also hit the bell. That way you can get the alerts and all of the fantastic content that we're putting out here on Breakthrough News, like, for instance, Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Many, many great interviews with many, many great people. It's my pleasure to be able to consume that. But nevertheless, make sure you hit that subscribe, hit the bell. Sorry, I'm getting a little confused here. I was going to say share. I also want you to hit the share button wherever you may be watching, so whoever's following you can be following on us as we move forward here.
And I see someone in the chat is asking where our salute is. So I'm going to take my left hand and I'm going to salute you, Eugene.
I'm saluting with my right hand because I think it looks better on camera because it's actually, on my left when I look at the camera. So it makes me feel better.
That's probably true. I'll allow it. Another thing I will allow is if people want to donate in the super chat. We were having an issue with it last week. We're not sure if it's still working this week. So for those who are watching, if you want to throw money in the super chat, it's a great time to do it so we can test out if it does in fact still work or not. And if it does still work, if you leave a comment, we'll try to read it on air, assuming that I deem it to be appropriate.
Indeed.
I'm very excited about my sensorial duties.
Well,
yeah.
You know, it's good to bring joy to your work. Well, we also have with us, as we always do here, Juan in the wild, not in the booth. I just feel like I have to change that due to some slanderous words about where Juan is, but you are behind glass. Juan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I don't know why I said welcome back.
I don't know either.
I don't know.
Like
because he hasn't
broke
left.
That cycle.
He
also
hasn't left. It's silly to welcome him back when he's just been stuck in the booth, trapped where he's imprisoned.
Wow. Well, listen.
Forced to.
Could be worse places. It's a very nice booth. I'm looking there right now. It's very good.
Is there central air? I mean, if there's central air,
there's heating too.
Yeah, I mean,
24-hour electricity, unlike
a
what
box
I have
is
in
a box.
Beirut. Maybe I should move to the booth.
Yeah, well, we'd be happy to have you. Juan, we were talking a little bit earlier this week about the New York police department, the NYPD. For those who maybe have not seen, there's a little bit of a controversy going on here in New York. There is a vaccine mandate for public workers. A number of police officers are refusing to be vaccinated, which, Juan, I think you can co-sign, is pretty much on brand because they also refuse to wear masks for most of the pandemic. And then there was a march, I believe, is that in the Brooklyn Bridge, Juan?
Yeah, it was a Brooklyn Bridge.
Brooklyn Bridge, and for anyone who knows New York City, it's, essentially fascistic, the laws they have around protests. It's almost impossible to protest here. And certainly it's essentially totally impossible to protest on the Brooklyn Bridge. Many, many people have been kettled on the Brooklyn Bridge, arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. It's sort of taking the bridge and succeeding is always considered a big deal in the politics of New York because the police are so just anti-free speech that they make it very difficult to protest. These cops are on the Brooklyn Bridge, shutting down traffic. Not only were they not arrested, I believe you looked at the video closer than I want. I didn't even see any, I guess they're all cops, uniformed cops even policing the demonstration in the same way they usually will, having it completely surrounded on all sides. I mean, it was just such a commentary on everything. And here we go. We have some of the imagery here of them marching.
Big flag.
Huge American flag. I guess this is about freedom. Okay.
And Christianity.
Yeah, freedom,
if
Christianity.
we're to believe the big cross. Jesus.
I mean, everything about this is just. I just can't get away from the fact that the NYPD, pretty much from the beginning of the pandemic to the end, has been the most resistant of anything to address the pandemic. I mean, when they were coming out saying everyone should have masks, everywhere you went, cops, no masks. Vaccines, they don't want to take the vaccine. I mean, everything is just so, they want to be treated so differently than everyone else when it comes to this public health measures. But when they murder somebody and people say, well, hey, maybe they should be subjected to the same type of justice as all the rest of us, they say, oh, well, no way, this is terrible. So, I mean, it really is selective freedom there, Juan.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, as we know, right? Like last year, there was a bunch of people arrested crossing that same bridge. The same, like back during Occupy Wall Street, where there was like 250 people that were arrested crossing the bridge, really demanding human rights, really like asking for justice. But like we have like the most right-wing people currently protesting the fact that they have to take a vaccine that's really for like the health of everybody else, right? And these same people, you saw that "Don't Tread on Me" flag.
Yeah,
you saw that. Like I feel like that's you kind of see who's in the crowd with that, and it's like city workers. It's not only police officers. There's also people from the fire department, which the fire department in New York City also has a long history of racism.
Yes.
But like when you start seeing the people that are standing next to you and the people that are standing behind you, at some point you have to realize maybe this is like the wrong crowd. Even if, like, let's say you're like a strong anti-vax person and but you're not a right winger, right? And you're in this crowd and you're surrounded by police officers. The people that agree with you are Floyd Mayweather and Kyrie. Like you kind of gotta realize, where are you in the world?
No, I know. And when Kyrie was protesting, for the movement for Black Lives and policing, he was like the worst person ever, and all these people hated him, and now he's like their hero. I mean, it just says everything about everything. The NYPD, if you protest them killing someone, you're a terrible individual. You're destroying the world. You're causing murders to go up. You should be jailed, beaten, arrested. But if they have to take a vaccine, then it's like, oh, we better get out there and protest.
Yeah, and no, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I was just gonna add one thing that I did see. Like there was some rally. I don't remember if it was DC or New York, but there was like a woman speaking who was saying, "No, we're not like right wing. This is everybody of all ideological stripes. Like I'm a left winger and I'm here." And like right behind her was this big banner that said "Communism kills." And I'm just like, I think that Juan made a really good point. It's like, okay, like I disagree with the anti-vax like ideas and theories and just all the things that they're saying. I do understand it spans the political spectrum. But if you do find yourself being anti-vax and you're at a rally and everybody around you is like holding up Trump banners and "Don't Tread on Me" flags and like "Communism kills" banners, like what are you doing?
You're a right winger now. Like, I'm a right winger now.
Yeah, I mean, you basically look. The company you keep says a lot about who you are. There's no doubt about that. And for sure, yeah, that was at a rally. That was in New York. It was at a rally around a lawsuit around whether or not this mandate is legal. But yeah, I saw a number of people shopping that around as like it was like busting myths. But the only thing I caught was the giant banner that was like 50 feet long saying "Communism destroys democracy," and I just thought, well, I mean, in a way. It makes sense that these people would be there, but in another sense, anyone who thinks this is somehow, enlightening for those who are opposed to vaccines, I don't know. But I mean, it just speaks to the role of the media to me that, you look at teachers, you look at nurses, you look at doctors, the overwhelming majority of them all are vaccinated, but it's like if 10 people say they're not going to be vaccinated, even the New York Times, so-called liberal newspaper, I remember they ran this screaming headline about this very issue the day that nurses had to be vaccinated, and it was like, crisis, nurses, hospitals may collapse. It was something like that. And then, paragraph 9, it was like, and 96% of all nurses are in fact vaccinated. And then of course the next day it was like, oh, hey, there was no crisis. But, people will pick up on this, whether they're conservative media, liberal media, the mainstream media has recognized that, controversy around getting vaccinated or not, it drives clicks, it drives views, gets eyeballs on your work. So even, those so-called august outlets like the New York Times are still abusing the facts on the ground, the reality, in order to push a certain, business agenda.
It was the same thing with Trump when Trump got elected, right? They said they didn't agree with Trump, but he was good for views, right? He was good for clicks.
Yeah. Well, let's move to Kyle Rittenhouse real quickly. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rania.
I was going to say one quick thing. It actually reminds me a lot of climate change, what you just said, which is where the vast majority of like the scientific community, the medical community, like 90-something%, 95, 96, 97% is not only getting vaccinated, but they're saying that like the science behind this is sound. And then because of that tiny percentage drives clicks, just like with climate change, you see that same giving both sides narratives and making people think that the opposition to vaccines is actually a bigger deal and deserves more attention than it actually should get. Anyways.
I do want to show one thing real quick before we move forward.
Please.
But like, look at this crowd. Like, look at this crowd. Like, look at all these Oakley glasses. Look at these American flags. Look, this is like a MAGA march.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it was anything else, people would be like fully against it. In fact, I'm seeing barely any coverage around it.
Yeah, no, I know. Well, I mean, honestly, the way they're taking the streets and things like that, no cops. That never happens in New York City.
I feel like they're using the Trump font from the "Make America Great Again" for these signs in the back, the "Stop the glorifying tyrant."
Well, it reminds me of too is the police riot in 1993 with Rudy Giuliani. Where they just came and they tore up downtown New York and no one did anything, but they were allegedly doing it because they were like, I don't know, trying to stop crime or whatever they said they were doing. But there's obviously two rules when it comes to what is allowed to happen on the streets. If you're some far right, I mean, there's that issue over the summer when they were protecting those Proud Boys who were coming into Times Square in those dumb little, flash mob type things where they try to show up and say, hey, we went to New York, man, look how tough we are. And of course, they're completely surrounded by cops the whole time. It's whatever, we know. But while we're talking about right-wingers and Nazis and other assorted terrible people, I want to just briefly mention this Kyle Rittenhouse situation. For people who didn't see, Kyle Rittenhouse, who murdered a number of people there, was at the Kenosha situation there in Wisconsin. He's on trial now, and there's been a lot of controversy about it this week because the judge, in the context of ruling what was in and out of bounds, said that those who he shot could not be referred to as victims. So you can't call them victims even though he killed them. Now, there's a lot to this, I guess. I mean, the reason the judge is doing it is he says it's prejudicial, since what they have to prove, the prosecutors, is that he did in fact kill them, that it wasn't self-defense, and to call them victims would somehow, I don't know, make it prejudicial to the jury that they wouldn't be able to distinguish between whether or not he should have killed these people or not. I've seen all sorts of things on right-wing media, something about how someone was pushing a flaming dumpster at him. I don't really know, but it just feels if you killed people and shot people, that calling them victims is pretty straightforward. But nevertheless, it's been banned from the trial. And obviously, I don't know what is going on with this judge, but certainly seems to me that's the type of decision you make when you want to put the thumb on the scale.
And it's such garbage because that's been banned, but the lawyers are allowed to call the protesters rioters, looters, and arsonists.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they might be confused by saying that they saw someone pushing a flaming dumpster to the gas station. I think they actually saw Kyle Rittenhouse, who is a flaming dumpster, near the gas station.
You know, it's good. No, but I hear you. It is confusing. I mean, in a real sense, it does create confusion about who's who and what's what. I also saw, I believe, if this is the same situation, that they were asking all the prospective jury members what they thought about Antifa. And if you follow right-wing media, you can already kind of see what the defense is going to be, is that there are a bunch of Antifa thugs out here trying to destroy businesses, and poor little Kyle Rittenhouse is out there with his assault rifle, which is doing the best he could to defend American private property against these Antifa thugs, probably paid by Russia or China, out here to destroy everything. That'll be their position. That'll be their line. And, you know, obviously saying that you can't call the people he killed victims will play into helping that narrative gain traction.
So real quick, since we're on this topic, we do have a
Yes.
super chat, and I think it's actually somebody who often contributes, Abu Haram. So thank you.
Yes.
Again, we always appreciate your support, and this is actually a really good point.
Mhm.
Abu Haram notes that an anarchist EMT from Florida named Daniel Baker has been sentenced to 44 months for a tweet, basically comparing that to the sort of like gloves on approach with Kyle Rittenhouse,
Yeah.
where his victims aren't even called victims.
That's a good point. I think
because the
that
judge-
tweet was
I mean,
about January 6th, too. It's a wild case.
I mean, it just either way, like if there's a judge who is saying that the people that you put a bullet in and killed aren't considered victims, like that judge is on your side. That's actually really disturbing. It's
Yeah.
disturbing. And we really have a problem in this country. I mean, Eugene, you and I have talked about this before, about the situation with judges across this country and just how right-wing and awful so many of them are.
Yeah.
And, you know, you see like all across the country in courts, there's poor black and brown people and poor white people who get sentenced to jail without any representation or really any chance to defend themselves or really know how to defend themselves because they have no money. And then you've got this where people like Kyle Rittenhouse protecting private property, doing the job of capitalism, you know, gets the kid gloves. It's ridiculous.
It is.
And
Yeah.
they can't say like this wasn't his plan, right?
Right.
Like regardless what his lawyers are trying to say, like you went there with
an
a
assault
loaded
rifle.
gun, with an assault rifle, right?
Yeah.
And he shot it and he killed people.
Yeah.
Like that's what
he's just a random dude. It's not like, I mean, you just went on your own power. Everything
He was
about it is
collaborating.
ridiculous. Yeah.
Well, he was collaborating with the police. Like we saw video from that night.
Yeah.
Him and others like him came from out of town. Like all of these cops and police chiefs are always complaining that, you know, outside agitators are coming and doing all these like left-wing, you know, protests that are funded by Russia and China or something.
But they're not coming with
And
guns.
then you
They're not coming
actually
with
had
guns.
somebody encouraged by his parents, brought his assault rifle, who's a freaking teenager who was incited by like officials to come help the police, and the police let them.
Yeah,
like,
they were like throwing them water and
from
stuff.
outside,
That
he
famous
drove, like
video.
how many miles? He wasn't from Kenosha.
He was running with an assault rifle. And police passed right by him. We saw the video of him running with an assault rifle after he shot people.
Yep.
And the thing is that like now they're saying this flaming dumpster, but in those videos there was no flaming dumpster, right? Because the person followed him afterwards, and so it's they can say whatever. There's people online, so-called even people that call themselves liberals, that are saying that like, oh, he was trying to protect the gas station.
I mean, but that's not his job. I mean, you can't be like, hey, I randomly showed up somewhere with an assault rifle to protect a business I have no relationship to, and then I just started opening fire on people I subjectively perceived to be a threat to this property that, again, I have no relationship to. That's not a real thing. I mean, it's unbelievable.
The people that he murdered were trying to stop him from shooting other people. Like we saw those videos where they saw him actively shooting and they put their lives on the line to stop other murders. That's what I saw.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how it all plays out. I mean, the sad thing is that he's probably got coin flip of a chance, maybe better than that to get off. I don't think it's a sure thing at all. And, Wisconsin, quiet as it's kept, even though people say all the racism's down south. A lot of people sympathize with those kind of beliefs in Wisconsin. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a close run thing. We'll just have to see what happens with Kyle Rittenhouse and many others. Also, just by the way, the Unite the Right trial, the civil rights lawsuit against those who created the Unite the Right in Charlottesville, also ongoing in Charlottesville right now, in fact. So we're going to get some verdict on both of those probably in the next few weeks, and we will absolutely keep you up to date on all of that here on Breakthrough News on the Freedom Side Live in particular. But we are going to switch stories to another bad story involving terrible racist, and this one is happening in the apartheid Israel, the Palestinian lands, and that's the criminalization of human rights organizations there by the Israeli government. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Hadil Shatara, who's the Palestinian coordinator of Samidun, Palestinian political prisoner organization. Hadil, thank you so much for being back with us.
I think she might be muted.
Oh, you might be muted.
Yeah, we cannot hear you.
Now we can hear you. There we go.
It goes.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you for having me again.
Hadil, it's great to have you back on. And you actually belong to one of these groups that Israel, the Israeli government, has labeled as terrorist organizations. 6 groups, 6 Palestinian human rights groups, including Adamir, Al-Haq, Bisan Center, Defense for Children International, and then, of course, your organization, the Samidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, as well as the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. The Israeli government has labeled all of these groups as terrorist organizations, claiming that they have affiliation with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which is a leftist liberation organization that has existed for a long time. And this has been condemned by the international human rights community. So I guess, can you start off by letting us know how this designation is going to impact the work of an organization such as yours?
One more organization that was added, which is the WATI, to the list. So they added Samidun to the list in February, while the other 6 organizations were added. Well, it's not surprising. The attack on these organizations started a while ago because these organizations are not only working on human rights, but also are carrying the narrative of the Palestinians. So attack was, we've seen this coming. We were ready for this attack. These organizations had raids to their offices. They took them. They arrested many of their employees. And if you look at the work that they're doing, you're talking about the agricultural committee who are working in Area C, who are helping the farmers, important building assistant economy in the country. Talking about the women committee, then you're talking about women's right, a committee that is defending right, which is a main part of the Palestinian struggle against the occupation and the patriarchy that they're creating on the area. If you're looking at defend the children, then this is crazy, because how could you attack an organization that is working on defending children's rights? So the targeting did not surprise us at all. It was it's a hit for these organizations to stop them from carrying the Palestinian narrative to the world. They don't only work locally, their work is an international work. They're showing the people what's really going on. They're criminalizing this occupation. So the Israeli occupation, the Zionist occupation, is stopping any organization from working and defending the Palestinian right towards liberation and freedom. So this is why the attack happened. They chose Al-Damir because Al-Damir are defending the Palestinian prisoners. They chose Al-Haq because it's a human rights organization that's carrying the narrative in many languages around the world. So it was not surprising to attack these organizations. It was not surprising to put them under these circumstances, because they want these organizations to start fighting against this decision of terrorizing them, rather than working on what they're really doing and the job that they're really doing, which is a great job, for whether you're talking about civil society organization or on human rights or in defending the civilians here in Palestine.
Yeah, and Hadil, what does it mean for people such as yourself who work for these organizations? I mean, what does it mean about your ability to get funding? Because this designation, I know you operate in the West Bank, but does this designation from Israel mean that international donors now aren't going to be able to fund groups like Samidun that do this crucial work?
This is the main idea behind all the hit. It's to stop the funding. In Samidun, we're working voluntarily, so we don't get funds, but the other 6 organizations depend on the fund they get. So they're targeting them in order to stop the donors from funding them. So this needs to mobilize to protect these organizations. Yes, it's going to affect the donor's relationship with these organizations. But we have to note something, that this designation is only made by the Zionist side. It's not an international designation. So if we don't protect them now, if we don't mobilize internationally and stand behind them and protect them, then they're going to shut down. These employees are going to go home, and no one is going to be able to speak about the Palestinian narrative anymore. So yes, the main target is to target the funding that they get, to target their relationship with the donors outside and abroad, and it's a very strong tool that they started using against organization. First, it started with student bloc, by terrorizing student blocs in order to find a way to put these students behind the jails and behind the bars. And then they moved to any organization that are working on any international level to defend any Palestinian right that we're talking about. And now they're choosing organizations by name. So the targeting started long time ago. They started on a huge scale. When they did not succeed, they started targeting the small organization that are carrying this narrative and that they're doing actual work on the ground. Each one of these 6 organizations, along with Samidun the 7th, are doing actual work on the ground, and not only in the West Bank. You're talking about huge programs in Gaza. You're talking about the 48 planes. So you're talking about organizations that are covering all Palestine and even the people abroad who are living in the Shatat and refugee camps.
And I mean, just for those who are watching to understand, as those of us who live outside of Palestine, Israel has such a strong presence in the international media and is able to give its narrative and its numbers. And these organizations that it targeted, whether we're talking about the work you do at Samidun, which keeps us in the know about how many Palestinian prisoners there are, how many children prisoners there are, what's happening inside of these prisons, is coming from your organization. Groups like Adamir as well as Al-Haq, Defense for Children International, collects information about the number of children that are killed and injured in these attacks on the West Bank and Gaza. They're the ones that do the investigations to find out what happened and how it happened when the Israelis shoot and kill, as they often do in the West Bank, Palestinian children or imprison them. I mean, these organizations are doing such crucial work, and those of us outside depend on them for this information. So it's very clear why the Israelis did this. I'm curious, what are the avenues to challenge this? Obviously, like you said, the international community is not on board with this. You have, a strong presence of organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International condemning this, which is a good thing. And then, of course, the United States issued these very soft statements of, we disagree with this. We're not sure how, if we're okay with it, but they're not. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. But is there a way for you to challenge this inside Palestine?
Yes, of course. First of all, we don't really count on what the U.S. Representative and government says, because we all know that they're only saying this because they're trying to put their peace for prosperity plan again on the table, and which is not acceptable for the Palestinians. But if you look at the international world, there's a lot to do. internationally as well as locally. If you're talking about the local level, it's our job as Palestinians who are living here, whether in West Bank, 48 lands, or in Gaza, to support these organizations, to stop them from closing these organizations, and to have faith in the continuous work that and the amazing work that they're doing to criminalize the occupation. Israel and the Zionist occupation will not allow any Palestinian to work towards criminalizing them. And this has been known internationally, and this has been known for a long time now. And yes, they have a strong propaganda against the Palestinians, and this is one way to start working on it. The six organization launched a campaign, a Twitter campaign, a Twitter storm that started 2 hours ago, using the hashtag Stand with the Six, in order to let the people know what kind of work that they're doing, why is it important to support these organizations. Locally, they've been covering everything that is happening with them on a media level. They're asking people to support and to mobilize for these organizations. And this is what we should be doing as Palestinians who are living in Palestine. It's our job and duty to make sure that these organizations stay open. It's our job and duty to find other ways of funding for these organizations, because the work they're doing, they're affecting all of our lives. On whether on the prisoner side, you're talking about children's side, you're talking about agricultural work, you're talking about women's rights, you're talking about economic studies. They're targeting the main task that we need to be working on towards liberation and freedom. So it's our job to be the supportive and the protectors of these six organizations. They've been raiding these organizations. They've issued a statement, a military statement against one of these organizations to be closed for 6 months, which is the Agricultural Workers Committee. So they're using international propaganda against this organization, and now they're adding them to the terrorist list to scare the funders, to the international world dealing with these organizations. It's not only about the fund; it's about even contacting these organizations to get the information. So when you're listed on the terrorist list, then it's going to be dangerous to deal with such an organization.
Hadil,
So
I just
it's
want
our
to ask
job
you.
to keep them
Sorry.
working.
Go ahead.
Well,
I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you, because this is so important. What can those of us outside, and you mentioned a Twitter storm, but beyond that, what can those of us outside of Palestine who are very upset about this do to help you guys in the struggle as you deal with the situation?
Of course, Twitter storm is not enough to protect these organizations. We can mobilize for these organizations. We can defend them internationally. We can find ways to fund these organizations, making them heard, publishing their research, publishing the statements they're working on, publishing all the testimonies that they've worked on. They have a lot of materials to be published, these organizations, and their work need to be shown internationally. So if their work is shown, if we fight the criminal Israeli side by the facts and the figures that these organizations are working on, then we're going to be able to support them. We're going to be able to show the other side of the story that these organizations are trying to do. So we need to keep the funding coming. We need to make sure that the organizational work that they're doing is heard and is published internationally. We need to stop against the Israeli government and the Israeli side and the fact that they're targeting the civil society work. And we know that civil society is an important part of any country, because and here, especially Palestine, when you're talking about the BA, which we all know what they're doing. We know that they're not working towards the liberation and freedom at the moment, and with the policies that they're taking and the security coordination they're working on. So the civil society, at the moment, is one of the most important tools that we're using against the occupation side. It's a tool that is making people to be heard, making the Palestinian narrative to be published. So helping these organizations' voices to be heard is an important action to be taken at the moment. Protecting these organizations from closing down, showing the real side of the story is important for this organization to keep on working.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Hadil, and helping just to expose, the reality of what's going on here with this and other things. And as always, joining us here on Breakthrough News. Again, that's Hadil Shatara with Sami Doon, the Palestinian Political Prisoners Organization. Thanks again for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, it's just what can we even say? These people are so ridiculous. No matter what the Palestinians do, they're criminalized, they're killed, they're beaten, they're jailed. Obviously, it's the olive harvest season right now. These settlers are going around ripping up people's trees, beating people up when they're trying to harvest their crops. I mean, just everything about it. It's so infuriating because it's so obvious. Like, that's what I always think when I'm, hearing about pieces like this and hearing from Hadil and the work that they're doing there is it's not veiled. Because since they have the support of the United States, they can do whatever they want, no matter how openly. And I think that is the most frustrating thing. This is an overused term, but it really is like gaslighting when this issue comes up in the international forum because of the role the U.S. plays.
Absolutely. And of course, this comes like on the heels of Israel announcing like all these new settlements, and the US response to that was like, well, we disagree with it. Well, then stop funding them. Yeah. Like, they literally wouldn't exist without you. So you obviously don't care. But no, this is incredibly dangerous what they've done because, like she said, these organizations are so crucial to us knowing the numbers and the details about what's happening to Palestinians. And when you label those groups terrorists, you cut off their funding, you make it impossible for them to function as organizations. And then, like you always mention, no matter what Palestinians do, it's criminalized. If they respond with armed resistance, it's criminalized as terrorism. If they respond with nonviolent resistance, they're shot and still called terrorists. And if they respond with NGOs, like funded by international organizations, they're still classified as terrorists. So literally what you're saying is Palestinians just shouldn't exist. Yes. Like, that's the only way they'll not be called terrorists, is if they just don't exist. That's the mentality here.
No, I think it's true. I think that's true. Their very existence is inconvenient for the plans of obviously the Zionists, but also the United States, and it really is just disgusting, quite frankly. Well, when it comes to the U.S. doing terrible things around the world, sadly, Israel isn't the only terrible government that they're supporting. So we want to turn our attention here to the country of Honduras, where there's really a critical election upcoming here that, may change the status quo of what we've seen since the 2009 coup in Honduras. We are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Zoe Alexandra, who's a co-editor and journalist with the indispensable People's Dispatch. Zoe, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. I know I'm not supposed to say that anymore, super chat, sorry. But it really is. We're really grateful to have you here. And, I think for a lot of people, Zoe, probably the last time they've thought too much about Honduras is what happened in 2009. Maybe they've heard a little bit about the issue of drug trafficking and the president. But I think maybe just to start, give us a capsule view of the stakes in this upcoming election in Honduras.
Well, the upcoming election is a really important process. It'll be the fourth elections held since the coup d'etat in 2009. In the past three elections, the ruling party, the National Party of Honduras, of the far right, has won all of these elections, through, we'll get into it a bit later, I'm sure, but, not always through the most legal means. And in this upcoming elections, actually today, a poll was just released, and the left-wing candidate Xiomara Castro appears to be polling ahead by 17 points, ahead of the candidate of the National Party of Honduras. That's just one aspect of it. Of course, Honduras has been, mired in multi-level crisis over the past decade, which we've seen, especially in the United States, really come to boil over with the migrant crisis. The levels of poverty in Honduras are really, unheard of. I mean, over 70% of the population in poverty, truly horrible conditions that the people of the country having to suffer through because of endemic corruption, because of the government just turning over all the natural resources, all of the of its sovereignty to foreign companies, to private capital, not in favor of the people. And so that is kind of the situation in Honduras today. There's of course high levels of violence, very low indicators of access to education, access to healthcare. We can go into it a bit later over the the struggles that the people have been waging over the past decade. But across the board, it has been a decade of resistance, but also extreme pushback, extreme repression from these forces that were responsible for the 2009 coup d'état.
Well, I really appreciate that capsule view. I mean, I think this has sadly been obscured from view here in the United States. I mean, it's come a little bit more into the forefront with Kamala Harris's trips to Central America. But I mean, it just seems like the height of hypocrisy, Zoe, what's happening here. Because I mean, everything you just mentioned about how terrible it just, sort of a living, breathing human rights violation is the government of Honduras. Yet they have almost total support from the United States. And Honduras is not on the list of governments that's demonized by the US. I mean, it just seems to speak to, maybe this is obvious, but it just seems to speak to a reality here that US policy in Central and Latin America is not, in fact, governed by the freedom, the democracy, and, whatever capacity building or whatever Kamala Harris was shopping when she was down there.
Sorry, that was
I think it's a clear example because I mean, you see, even the Organization of American States, which has been fundamental in pushing Washington's agenda. Of course, we saw the very clear example in Bolivia, with Cuba historically, with Venezuela, in Honduras following the elections in 2017, which were in itself illegitimate in the sense that Juan Orlando Hernandez actually pushed forth a constitutional amendment saying that he could run for president again, when in Honduras it's illegal to run for a second term. Even then, he goes to the elections, commits massive electoral fraud. The Organization of American States is one of the first organizations to say these were illegitimate victory. He did not win the elections. Fraud was committed. And then as soon as the United States, which at this point Donald Trump was president, as soon as they gave their approval for this victory, we saw all the other countries fall in line. But there was actually massive outrage from countries that, usually would be on the side of, the US's allies in the region, because it was so brazen and just completely a violation of the people's will and really what the people were asking for. And following this electoral fraud, we saw, a horrific violence on the streets. The militarized police, which were created in the aftermath to the coup d'état in 2009, just brutalizing the people on the street. Over 40 were killed, dozens rounded up and thrown in prison because they were opposing this completely illegal electoral fraud. And this is kind of, super important to keep in mind, especially for this upcoming electoral process, because we've seen that, even if the Honduran oligarchy commits outrageous crimes, making up ballots, I mean, it's really, really looking into, how they actually manufacture the victory is quite interesting. Even if they commit these crimes, the US is going to stand by them and say, yeah, not the same. Don't do it like that. It was a little too obvious, but you can get away with it. And so when we're seeing that Xiomara Castro, who's the left candidate from the Libre Party, who actually made an alliance with the former presidential candidate from 2017, Salvador Nasrallah, they made an alliance. And I mean, can we expect that another situation of fraud could happen? It's unclear, but it's obviously on the table.
Mm.
Zoe, I'm curious if you could maybe also just describe a bit the guy that we're talking about, Juan Orlando Hernandez, because so much of what Venezuela is falsely accused of by the OAS with the backing of the US and what Nicaragua is accused of, they're constantly trying, and what Bolivia was accused of when Evo Morales won and then was pushed out in a coup that was backed by the US. It's always, election fraud. And you mentioned that this right-wing apparatus has stayed in power all these years since the coup that the US backed because of election fraud that doesn't get called out. But we also constantly hear the US accusing these countries of narco trafficking. and of so much violence against opposition. And I just think that, all of these complaints that we falsely hear about Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela actually do apply to America's allies, including the narco trafficking accusation. So can you shed some light on the narco trafficking that's taking place when it comes to Honduras, which seems to take place, by the way, as you've mentioned before, in every country that has U.S. backing in Latin America? There seems to be a narco trafficking problem. But go ahead. Let's hear about this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a crucial element. Juan Orlando Hernandez, his brother Antonio Hernandez, is currently, in prison. He was accused in a New York City by a New York City judge for having participated in drug trafficking of, thousands of tons of cocaine, and using this money to help with the presidential campaign of Juan Orlando Hernandez in 2013, 2014. And so this is a direct tie of the current president of Honduras to drug trafficking. He's even mentioned in the reports that that the prosecutors in New York have made. He's commonly referred to as co-conspirator 4. And so when these reports came out, of course, it provoked widespread outrage among the Honduran people. Reading the reports, it's quite clear that co-conspirator 4 is Juan Orlando Hernandez, just because of the contextual cues. And so following these charges and this report coming out, there were, once again, protests in the street against Juan Orlando Hernandez. Almost, since 2017, there have been constant protests, whether it be against his clear involvement in drug trafficking, which has been proven not only, within Honduras, but, by a U.S. court. This has been constantly announced. He's also very implicated in corruption schemes, which of course are deeply linked to, illegal economy in the country. But under his watch, a UN-sanctioned corruption investigation committee was actually dismantled, and all of its power was taken away because they were precisely investigating members of his own party. They were arrested. It was Honduras' own Pandora Papers. And, a bunch, I think it was maybe over 20 members of the National Party were accused of having participated in corruption schemes. And they were, released, and also that this investigative body was dismantled and taken all of its powers. They couldn't look into corruption in the past. And, that was that. He's going to leave office as a sitting president, not stand trial for any of the multiple crimes that he has partaken in, from corruption to drug trafficking to violence against his own people.
Incredible.
It really is.
Incredible.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's Joe. I mean, you can just do whatever you want. Well, I mean, but it also seems... I actually want to ask another question, but I mean, obviously, Zoe, you also cover Colombia very closely, and it's like we're living in a bizarro world where allegedly Nicolas Maduro is running all drugs everywhere in the world, but in fact, like Colombia and Honduras is running the drugs. But we'll save that for another time, and certainly we'll absolutely have to keep talking about Colombia here, where there's many important things happening. But I also want to just ask you, in terms of Honduras, and you mentioned it earlier, talk a little, if you could, about what the popular movements have been doing, because I think this has been so invisibilized. You only really hear in terms of Honduras is immigration to the United States and violence and other things like that. And I think many people might assume there is nothing going on in terms of popular struggles.
For sure. I think this is a crucial element. And I think we can look at maybe the 2009 coup as kind of a turning point in resistance in Honduras. When the coup happened, it was unprecedented mobilizations were seen across the country. Many people went to the capital, and there was almost months of constant protests. People, popular organizations that had already existed in the country, protecting the Venezuelan embassy, protecting the Cuban embassy. So this is, movements on the streets who are very conscious of the role that Honduras plays in the imperialist, plan and the strategy in the Central America and the region as a whole, Latin America and the Caribbean. When the coup happened, the first actions that were taken were to strip the people of their fundamental rights. So, for example, there were attacks on labor. There were attacks on women's rights. Misoprostol, which is the pill, the morning after pill, which also is, emergency abortion pill, was taken away, was outlawed. Both misoprostol and the morning after pill. So attacks on women's rights. One of the key developments that happened after the coup was also the imposition of a neoliberal economic model. And so this saw, the opening up of free trade zones within Honduras, so giving transnational corporations essentially free reign over Honduran territory to not have to respond to the local legislation, labor codes, to not have to pay, a living wage, being tax exempt. And these created kind of these, tax havens, but also labor havens for transnational companies. And then at the same time, there was also kind of the attack on the territories of Honduras. So, just an all-out attack on natural resources and concessioning, key parts of the country where communities had historically lived and, existed and survived, and giving these to transnational corporations. So in the wake of this essentially neoliberal attack and onslaught, also to mention, this was a moment of intense militarization, the creation of the military police and other bodies directly supported by the US government. The military police officers were all trained in the US by US officers, a nice little program they have there. And so in the wake of this imposition of this, model of a society that's militarized, that's the people are not granted access to education and healthcare, all of their basic needs, where the territories where they've, existed and subsided and, resisted for decades and centuries are now being taken away from them, no clean drinking water. People organized in response to these attacks and, continuing decades of resistance that had already started. So I think we see there was the emergence of the Libre Party in this moment. This came out of the National Front of Popular Resistance. This was created after the coup, and it, transformed into a party through this process of organizing a lot of times in the cities and with the traditional left in Honduras. And they were waging a lot of these battles, the labor battles with unions. In the territories, we see the strengthening of organizations such as the Civic Council of Indigenous and Popular Organizations of Honduras, COPIN. COPIN began to wage a series of very important battles in defense of the land. As I mentioned, the coup, there was hundreds of concessions given to transnational corporations for hydroelectric projects, for mining, for timber, for all sorts of natural resources. And so people were resisting in the territories these projects, organizing communities, and all sorts of other resistance that has continued. In the past, in 2018, there was a massive mobilization of students, teachers, healthcare workers, because the government was cutting the already severely reduced budgets for public education and healthcare. In Honduras, there are 30 public hospitals, if you can believe it. There are probably more than 30 public hospitals just in, New York City or the state of New York, and this country only has 30. So, really resisting against these attacks that were coming constantly to the people.
I mean, it just seems that this is such an important context because, obviously sort of one major side effect of this, of course, is the increased criminalization of immigrants here in the United States and people coming here, and also the demonization. And it just seems like, well, I don't know, I guess it seems like exactly what I'm saying, that you just can't separate the two issues. I mean, the way obviously people who hate immigrants in the United States point it is like, oh, well, they're coming here to steal our jobs or take our freedom. But I mean, hearing what you're saying, Zoe, I mean, it really feels that there is a direct connection between the risk people are taking to get from Honduras to the southern border of the United States and, what they're fleeing.
Yeah, I mean, if you can just look at the numbers of how, immigration from Honduras to the United States to see that this is directly linked. I mean, following the coup, there was a massive increase in immigration from Honduras to the US because people saw that they were not able to, maybe they were fleeing because of persecution. Maybe they were fleeing because they saw they could no longer get an education or, rights that they had enjoyed briefly under the government of Manuel Zelaya, social programs that had been started were quickly taken away. And so, people, and then today, I mean, even in the past five years, these conditions have deteriorated even more. And so there, in 2018, with the first series of migrant caravans, thousands of people, risking everything, traveling with their young children, because life in Honduras is unsustainable. The options for young people are to join the armed forces or the police, to join one of the criminal gangs, or to migrate. There's really nothing. It's very, very challenging to get an education. And even once you have a degree, there's no work because, the public sector has been hollowed out. We haven't even really gone into the horrific corruption that has happened in Honduras, but there was massive protests in 2015 against Honduras. In Honduras in 2015 against corruption. One of the big complaints then was that, for example, hospitals were giving people pills filled with flour. And so they were taking the money, instead of buying actual medicine, they were buying flour-filled pills. So, these kind of things, if you see this, how do you survive? How are you gonna make ends meet? And they can't. So people are, of course, forced to flee their homes, endure a horrific trip and very challenging circumstances, maybe risking being in a detention center, but because Honduras is not a sustainable place to live right now.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's such a clear, bright red line. I mean, Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, Cameroon, all these places where people are coming in such huge numbers. It's not only the social conditions, but the direct connection to the United States. But just real quick here, a few minutes left, give us a little taste of some of this corruption that you just mentioned there. I mean, I just hearing the flour pills, I mean, this seems like it's off the charts in terms of its seriousness.
Yeah, I mean, the flour pills was definitely, I think it's been one of the most symbolic, acts of corruption. But for example, in the pandemic, there was a pretty big multi-million-dollar contract Honduras made with a company to build, these campaign hospitals. So of course, many, as I mentioned, they only have 30 public hospitals. So when the coronavirus pandemic started, they were like, okay, let's try to prepare for the amount of patients that are gonna need to be attended to. And so the government made a contract with a private company to build, I forget how many now, hospitals, these temporary hospitals. And, I think it was maybe after 7 months of this contract being signed and the money being dispersed, what do you know? There was about one hospital built out of dozens that had been promised. So, things like these, in the capital, Tegucigalpa, which is one of the most dangerous cities, in the world, probably, there's not really a standardized public transportation system. Again, there was a project to build those dedicated bus lanes with a centralized bus system, and they measured wrong. The buses were too big, the lanes were too small, and who knows where the money went. And now in the city, they have these bus lanes that don't work. They have the buses, were never bought, and they just stand there as a monument to this, endemic corruption of the ruling class in Honduras, which has been, given a free pass to run away with the money, not invest in the people, and not create a better life for the people that have been, fighting for it for so many years.
Mm-hmm. Well, really appreciate you coming and giving us this primer for the upcoming elections in Honduras. And of course, I'll point people again to People's Dispatch. Great article up there. I believe it went up earlier this week about this. And Zoe, I believe you will be there on the ground. So we'll be able to keep following this and keep having you back here if you're willing on Breakthrough News to just help reveal what's really going on. Because I think sadly and unfortunately, the coverage from mainstream media won't be that good. But thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Always great.
Mm-hmm. Well, the pleasure's all ours. I'm just not going to let that go. I don't even know who you are, whoever made that comment. But
you really are stuck
I started
on
from
this.
actually wanting to allow that they maybe had a point, and now I think I'm becoming defiant. It is a pleasure to have people on. They're doing us a favor by coming here. Is it not our pleasure?
Eugene, just because one person complains doesn't mean you let it get to you this much.
You know what?
Come
I usually don't let the comments get to me,
I'm
but I
shocked.
really just
I know,
feel
that's why I'm
it is a pleasure. I am mad, Juan.
agree
You're
with
right.
you.
Juan is-
I agree with you, and I think you should keep saying it regardless of what one commenter said. Unless,
you.
here's the thing, unless somebody wants to donate like a few
Huge numbers of money.
$1,000s, in which case, I mean, a few thousand, come on, for like $5,000, you wouldn't just go a show without saying that.
Free the pleasure.
You know, even for $5,000, Rania, I don't know if I can be bought on this question because I am very, very grateful to everyone who comes on the show. It's very busy people doing a lot of fantastic things.
Stop
and
hoarding
the fact
all
that
the
they're giving us
pleasure.
some time. Go ahead, Juan, please.
we
So
have to
stop
be
hoarding all the pleasure.
Okay.
It's only
well,
Eugene's pleasure.
It's only
Eugene's pleasure.
No.
He's taking all the pleasure.
No,
But you know,
to
I
be
also
fair,
think
he is
this could
saying
be
the
like a
pleasure is all
culture.
ours. So
Yeah, you're implicated,
Yeah.
Rania. Don't think you can separate yourself at this point.
But
You
see,
were
I'm
a part
okay.
of this.
I'm okay with being openly selfish about that. Like I'm not like, if somebody were to be like, "How dare you? The pleasure's mine too," I'd be like, "Okay." And
Yeah.
I'd let it go. But Eugene, you're really stuck on this. I'm a
no,
little
he's,
concerned.
he's mad.
No,
I
but
also
in all
he's very
seriousness, shout out to whoever made that comment. We're having a little fun at your expense, but you know, we really appreciate you being here.
person's
In
like
fact,
crying right now.
the pleasure's all ours.
I love that it went full circle.
Well, we've got
That's
all
good.
sorts of great stuff coming up for you as the show rolls on here into hour two. We're going to be talking about the upcoming COP26 and how many people who should be doing something to help save the planet are not. But we have some great news in our upcoming segment. This is fantastic for those of you who are followers and patrons of Breakthrough News. Don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and donate that way. Next week, next Wednesday, November 3rd, will be the video debut of The Real Story from the Socialist Program here on Breakthrough News. Now, I know many of you who watch, you know the Socialist Program, you're following the Socialist Program. Some of you are also patrons of the Socialist Program. Excellent, fantastic podcast. Well, now, one day a week, their content will be coming to video, and it will be exclusive here on Breakthrough News. So mark your calendars next Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? November 3rd. It's November 3rd. I'm sorry. I'm not looking at the calendar. I think that's Wednesday, right?
Yeah, it is,
sorry.
it is.
It's definitely November 3rd. Mark that down, whatever day November 3rd is. The Real Story from the Socialist Program here on Breakthrough News. And we are very honored to have with us the host of the Socialist Program, Brian Becker. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
The pleasure is all mine.
Eugene, I think that you've been like one up.
I have to say,
I think was Brian the commenter?
Well, it's
Brian
possible.
the one?
Well, since it is in the midst of the World Series, that was like a leadoff home run here, so I appreciate that. Brian, thanks again for joining us, and for the tiny handful of people who've been living under a rock who haven't been following the Socialist Program, who will be, just tell us a little bit about the Socialist Program, what you guys do every week, certainly what The Real Story is bringing to the table, so they have a little bit of what to expect next week.
Sure, thanks so much. And it'll be a pleasure to be part of the Breakthrough team starting next Wednesday, November 3rd. We started the Socialist Program about a year ago. Took a while to choose the name, and I want to talk about the name because it was intentional, obviously. And there was a lot of deliberation and thought about whether to name it this. But we've been going for about a year. We have 3 days of content every week. The first day on Tuesday is In the News. We have Esther Averum, Nicole Russell, Walter Smolarek, and myself. We do the big stories in the news that we believe will be distorted in the corporate media or already are distorted. On Wednesday, we interview every week. I have a conversation with Marxist economist, Professor Richard Wolff, where we talk about the biggest stories in the economy, the crimes of capitalism, the crisis of capitalism. And then on Thursday, we do The Real Story, which is more or less a deep dive on a particular issue. Normally, I'm interviewing somebody and sometimes I'm doing the show by myself, but we did a 7-part series in The Real Story on China's foreign policy from 1949 to 2021 with Dr. Ken Hammond, who is the founder of the Confucius Institute in New Mexico. He's a professor of East Asian Studies. He speaks Chinese. He's been teaching in China for 40 years. He actually knows what he's talking about. He's also a Marxist and not completely uncritical of all things in China, but a supporter and sympathizer of the Chinese Revolution and admiring the huge accomplishments of China, including, and most importantly, perhaps lifting 850 million human beings out of dire poverty, extreme dire poverty, perhaps the greatest anti-poverty program and achievement in world history, and did it in a short amount of time. We interviewed Dr. Gerald Horn. I've talked with people from Afghanistan about the Saur Revolution in 1978, where the socialist and Marxist government tried to bring women's rights to the girls and women of Afghanistan, and the CIA declared war against them, which is how the Taliban eventually came to power. That was the time during which the U.S. was in an alliance with Osama bin Laden. Yes, in alliance with Osama bin Laden. So we cover a lot of territory that we think is interesting, important, and also widely distorted. And we come at it with a historical perspective that you won't find in most of the mainstream media. I want to say real quick about why we chose the name. After 1945, when the Cold War started, the United States canceled socialism. There's a lot of debate about cancel culture and so on and so forth. Socialism was canceled starting in 1946. There was a Communist Party in the United States of 100,000 people. Controlled 1/3 of the unions. It had a huge influence in the Black African-American community and the civil rights movement. It was destroyed during the Cold War, the witch hunt, and even socialists, in order to survive, had to self-censor. A lot of socialists by 1952, they decided to become social justice activists in their local Methodist church. And 10 years later, they were social justice activists who were Methodists. In other words, as Kurt Vonnegut, the author, said, you are what you pretend to be, so be careful when you pretend. And because Marxists and socialists had to pretend to be something else just to survive, just to talk, just to have a hearing, just to have some degree of credibility, just so that their jobs and careers would not be destroyed, socialism was largely extinguished. And we know that in the last few years, for a combination of factors, Occupy, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Bernie Sanders surprise campaign in 2016, and the repeat in 2020, there's a revival in the interest of socialism. And we thought, let's have a program where we can bring interesting news, historical perspective, an objective faculty, not using shrill rhetoric or the rhetoric of, just sort of marginalized left groups. In other words, an intelligent conversation, but openly as socialists, openly as Marxists, in order to expand this interest in socialism. And that's why we chose this particular name.
Well, it's a great name and it's a great show. And I have to say, we're really excited to have it here and have it on video for the very first time. Sorry, Rania, I cut you off. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm a longtime listener of your past show. I love the Socialist Program. So if anybody, like Eugene said, does live under a rock, you're missing out. You should absolutely be listening to it. It's so crucial. And as somebody who, I came into the left more through the issue of foreign policy than socialism. And so, there's a lot of theory that I'm still learning and a lot of history that I don't know. And I have to say, your program has been one of the most informative, especially for, I think, someone who's my age, who's really trying to learn the ways, like you said, that socialism has been attacked by the US and that there's been all these socialist revolutions around the world that we don't get to learn about. So I actually want to thank you for that and encourage everybody to go listen to it and just welcome you to the BT family. I'm so excited we're going to have a part of this incredible program on our outlet.
Yeah, and likewise, we too. I mean, we're We're so excited about Breakthrough News because what you and Eugene are doing and what the other members of your team are doing is it's really competing in terms of the professional production qualities with mainstream media, but providing a genuinely alternative point of view, meaning instead of using the accepted conventional wisdom of bourgeois American politics as your reference point, the reference point is anti-imperialism. The reference point is internationalism. It's solidarity between people. It's understanding that the problems that we have as a people or peoples are not because of failings and defects within the people, but there is a consequence of systems and institutions of power and institutions of exploitation and inequality. And one of the things that I think is so important about Breakthrough is, again, without it being sort of rhetorical or able to be put into a certain box, you're popularizing these basic core concepts which once heard are easily embraced by the people listening. I mean, if the two of you had your show once a week on CNN and 10 million people watched it, like 7 million of those 10 million would think like, this is great. I wish there could be more programming like this. 3 million of them would want to kill you, but 7 million would think, yeah, this is really good. We want more of this. And that's really the struggle for the left in many ways. It's the message resonates. The program, our program, like people should be entitled as a constitutional right to a job, a decent paying job or an adequate income. Healthcare should be free, not a commodity. Your house should be a guaranteed absolute right, and you can never be made homeless. You should be able to go to a doctor when you're sick and not get a doctor's bill. Same with your kids. When you have that messaging, these core programmatic messages of our movement, the people like them. I mean, weirdly, if Joe Biden hadn't, continued to retreat from even his modest, minimal program that brought some relief to the working class, he could have a heroic stature right now among a part of the population. And that's with somebody who can hardly speak, who has no capacity to be articulate or form real thought. He would still have like sort of a heroic stature. But here you have him just constantly meeting with Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and allowing the Washington Post to say these spending weary senators, like using these kind of characterizations for these extremists who are like trying to attack and deprive working class people of what they need because they're being paid by pharma, by big pharma in the banks. If Biden had actually gone on TV every night and said, every night or every couple nights and said, hey, everybody, this is what's in the bill. This is what's in the bill. Your kids are going to be able to go to college for free if you're working class and you want to go to community college. If you have a baby or get sick, you're going to have 14 or 20 days of family leave and it's going to be paid for. If you went through if you're older, if you're on Medicare, and right now you can't get a pair of glasses, which people on Medicare are not eligible to get a pair of glasses right now. Because of course, as people get older, their eyes just get better and better. Their hearing gets really improved. Their ears become like, mega hearing. That's why there's no, if Biden went and talked to the people on TV every night and said, this is what's in the bill, and then said to Manchin and Sinema, look, we're making a vote on this, where it's up or down. If you want to destroy the vote, if you want to destroy the things that people in America know about and love and will embrace, he could have won this battle.
Yeah.
But it's because he would have had the support of the people. And that's not a socialist program. That's just a mild sort of reform within the context of ugly, barbaric capitalism. But again, this is what's missing in politics. We need to have a politics. We need to have a media that fights. Like it's interesting. It's informative. It's not sort of shrill or able to be put into a box, but it has to have a fighting spirit to it. And that's what people are looking for. the ability to fight and to win. And all of these things are actually achievable. So that's another part of our program, is that we're not just podcasters, we're not just YouTubers, which we will now be. You know, we're lifelong, dedicated organizers and activists who firmly believe that change is possible, and firmly believe that we'll have the support of the people if we have a clear political program that speaks to their needs and has a fighting spirit about it.
No, I think that's such a good point. And it's just and taking this seriously, taking the stakes of these issues seriously. I mean, the point you make there about, what's the circus happening in Congress right now over this bill, and the ever shrinking. I mean, it's almost like, what's the point of doing it now? And it speaks to also the nature of it having a fighting media, of the need for an opposition overall, to me as well, Brian, because I mean, it's sort of like a with friends like these kind of moment, looking at what's happening with this bill and really the impact of money. I mean, as we've been talking so consistently, I've said, in a way, maybe we should stop talking less about Democrats and Republicans and more about billionaires and the ultra rich, because that seems to be who has the majority in Congress. I mean, it's almost unbelievable to look at the polling around many of these measures that they're now stripping out and throwing by the wayside. Some of them have a majority of Republicans supporting them. So there's no electoral calculus at all that would say, don't do this. In fact, every electoral calculus would say, this is like, we should have done this 80 years ago. But instead, what we see is like a life and death, tooth and nail fight to prevent people from having even the most basic needs. I mean, there's just no real opposition in this country, it feels like to me, Brian.
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing in Congress, where the Democrats have the House, they have the Senate, they have the White House, same as in 2009, they actually can do whatever they want to do. And they're not doing the things that are so easily achieved if they bump into any opposition from the capitalist corporations or the capitalist class. I mean, that's the reality. And here you have Biden, who is, instead of making the case on national TV, he's quietly, meeting with Manchin and Sinema. And then, so Biden is looking to the right. And then you have the progressive caucus that's looking to Biden. And they don't want to say anything because they don't want to hurt Biden right now. So as a consequence, everything moves to the right, even though we have mass support for all of these obviously needed programs. And so, the left has to take this into account. If anything makes the case actually for revolution, it's what we're witnessing right now in Congress, because every 2 or 4 years, we're told you have to support the Democrats. You must, because otherwise we'll have the Republicans. And if we get enough Democrats and we can control the different chambers and the White House, we can really make things happen. Well, that has happened. And it's doing these obviously needed things that are easily achieved and easily paid for. I mean, when you think about it now, the new plan is what, 1.5 trillion? Mm-hmm. That's like 20% of this year's defense budget, which is not a defense budget. It's an imperialist war budget. That's a 7.5 trillion over the next 10 years. But, again, here we have an obvious indication of what it means to have a democratically controlled Congress. And it's not enough. In fact, they're all in the pockets, as you said, Eugene. Why even talk about Democrats and Republicans? It's of, by, and for the rich, of, by, and for the capitalist class, of, by, and for Wall Street bankers and corporations and big pharma and private insurance companies. And the working class in the United States is suffering. And if we don't mobilize it in a fighting way for the things that people need, the country will actually go further and further to the right, because this pale, liberal, so-called left opposition of the Democrats looks ridiculous, because it is ridiculous, and it strengthens the hand of Trump and people even to the right of Trump. So we have to fight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I certainly couldn't agree more with that. It's as well, I think we're all on Breakthrough News now, so it's certainly the spirit of what we're doing on Breakthrough News. But I think this is going to be fantastic to have the real story from the Socialist Program here. Of course, everyone check into the Socialist Program, become a patron of the Socialist Program, follow it, listen to everything that they are doing. I think it will be tremendously edifying for you. But more important than anything else, November 3rd, here, Breakthrough News, the Socialist Program will be debuting on video. So that's a great reason, if you're watching on YouTube, to hit the subscription button, hit the bell so you can get the alerts, so that on November 3rd, you will be able to check out the first video episode of the Socialist Program. Brian Becker, thank you so much for joining us here, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.
Was it a pleasure?
It was all ours, in fact. The
Well, thank you very
Ours and
much.
only ours.
Shout out to that person. I'm sorry I don't even remember exactly who you are. I actually do feel bad we're having so much fun at your expense, but I appreciate you engaging and hopefully having fun with us. Just quickly wanted to make sure I was getting something right here. Sorry.
We had a couple super chats.
Yeah, Canadian dollars rolling
None about, yeah. Oh, did we get? Oh, we did get Canadian dollars, which are worth more
It's a
than
strong
American
currency. This is
dollars.
good for
So
us.
thank you. We got 2 Canadian dollar.
Well, I do want to shout
donations.
out Reed, who gave us some of those Canadian dollars, who made a fantastic point, which is that we should remind people of all of Zoe's great work at People's Dispatch, especially Give the People What They Want. Zoe, Prasanth, and VJ, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can check it out on the Facebook and I believe also the YouTube of People's Dispatch, and they are going through really the entire world every single week on Friday morning, and it's giving the people what they want. It's basically what you need to know. I would argue if you just follow Breakthrough News, follow People's Dispatch, follow the Socialist Program, you'll probably be one of the most well-informed people in the United States. There's no doubt about that. So quick shout out as well to Give the People What They Want, and Prasanth and VJ as well, who do a great job alongside Zoe there. So we want to just keep the movement moving on, as my friend Sean Blackman always says on his fantastic show, By Any Means Necessary. And we want to turn to COP26 coming up this weekend. Obviously, it is another, I don't know if it is an inflection point, but it's another opportunity for us to reflect on the climate catastrophe that is sadly right with us now. I mean, we cannot talk about it being something in the future. I mean, this is right now. Very happy to be joined again here by Brandon Wu, who is the Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA. Brandon, thanks so much for coming back with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, here we go again. The pleasure is all ours. But it really is. Brandon, going into this weekend, obviously the two things are working together or not working together with Congress and COP26 coming up. And if anything, I think it's just reminding us how much needs to be done and how little is being done in so many key areas. And one of the things I wanted to start with here is, how what's happening in Congress is going to be presented by the U.S. delegation. I mean, there's a lot of conversation that they're rushing to try to finish something to be able to announce it by the debut of COP26. But, you had a great piece recently about climate finance in particular, but I think sort of bringing into focus the scale of what needs to happen. How are you evaluating the at least potential climate measures in the budget reconciliation bill, and how does that measure up to, where we should be in terms of the U.S.'s fair share in this?
Yeah, this is, I gotta say, this is a hard moment for me. What I am used to doing, what my organization is used to doing, is saying, look, we can't just look at what's politically possible. We have to look at what science and equity demand. We have to look at what the U.S. fair share of climate action is globally, given our massive historical emissions, given the national wealth that we've built by destroying the climate and the environment. And that fair share is enormous. So we actually calculated that a few months ago and came up with a figure that the U.S. has to do the equivalent of reducing its emissions by 195% by 2030 from 2005 levels. And that means, what we were saying was that can be done through 70% domestic reductions. And then the rest of it has to be finance and technological support for developing countries to reduce their own emissions. We have to do both of those things. They go hand in hand. Without both, we cannot solve the climate crisis. Now, on the other hand, we've got what's going on in Congress and what's going on with the Build Back Better agenda, and how that, the original agenda was already not big enough, and it's only gotten watered down as the Democrats negotiate with themselves, as you've already talked about. And what we have left is, frankly, pathetic compared to the need. On the other hand, and this is where it gets hard, I think, when's the next time that we can actually pass anything, right? Because the Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot. They're probably going to lose in the midterms. We're going to get a bunch of climate deniers in our government again. So, do we wait another 10 years until we have another Democratic trifecta that's probably going to be just as ineffective? Do we hold out hope for an insurgent third party movement? In a different conversation, like those are valid arguments, but we're talking about a climate crisis where it's already too late and we have to act with as much urgency as possible right now. And so we're left with this picture where we kind of have to push for whatever we think we can get right now in this moment, without foreclosing the possibility of doing better in the future. And that, frankly, is a pretty hard place to be. So what we're saying about the COP is that whatever the US is coming to the table with is pathetically insufficient. There's just no way. Like, our politics are not in the right place. Everything is too dominated by the fossil fuel industry still. And we've got a long way to go. If, though, the Biden administration, says, if, say, they were able to pass the whole Build Back Better package, the original 3.5 trillion or whatever, even that wasn't going to be enough. But we could have said, look, this is a signal to the rest of the world that we're actually taking this seriously, right? And we know that this is not good enough, but we're going to be fighting. And this is sort of a first step. If, on the other hand, what the Biden administration wants to do now, right, is force a vote on the bipartisan infrastructure package, which is this pathetic, even more watered down thing, right? And they're trying to use the COP as an excuse, saying we need to pass this bipartisan package so that we can bring something to Glasgow. The world is going to laugh at that, right? If that's what happens, they're going to say this isn't even an honest attempt, right, to be serious about the problem. You can't tell us this is a climate bill. That's pathetic, right? So we'll see. I mean, whatever the U.S. does, it's not going to be enough. We already know that. But there are ways that it could signal that we're actually serious, and ways that it could signal that, we're the same old sort of imperialist power that's not living up to our responsibility to the rest of the world.
No, I think that couldn't be very well said, and I think that this is really just an extraordinarily tough moment. And I think this is in many ways why we've seen the level of urgency increase amongst those who are on the ground and organizing, because we have to, I think, push that level of urgency. Which brings me to my next question. And I mean, for years, maybe it's not even much of a question now, but I mean, I know for years one of the big challenges in talking around climate issues is people said, well, look, you don't want to say it's going to be too bad, because then people are going to be demoralized, they're going to be worried, and all these other pieces. But I mean, it seems to me that we can't avoid this now, even though it sounds catastrophic, because it is catastrophic. I mean, I was doing some research earlier this week on what would happen with the report coming out, or I don't know if it was a report, but the article by Brad Plumer talking about how the Earth is on track for 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And I couldn't even find that much information about how bad that was, because it was so bad. There are so many scientists and others that are like, we don't even know if we can predict what's going to happen when we get to this level. And even I, who, I feel like I'm attuned to these issues, I was kind of taken aback by that. I was like, wow, this is even worse than I thought. So, I mean, maybe it's not much of a question at this point because it's so serious, but it does seem that now sort of making it clear what the consequences are is maybe a more important fight than it has been even in the past.
Yeah, and I think that is getting easier as we're seeing more and more and worse climate disasters and climate impacts. I think the line that we have to walk, as you said, is how do we communicate that without being disempowering, right? There was a fad in journalism. It was actually a few years ago, which was this sort of climate apocalypse story about how it's too late, we're screwed, no matter what we do now, especially given our current global politics, we don't have a chance of solving this problem, and so we might as well dig in for the long haul, whatever that means. And a colleague of mine wrote what I think is a sort of evergreen piece. I don't know. Can I curse on this show?
Yes, you can.
Which was just he just called it "fuck your apocalypse." And his point was, if we give up, right, then we are giving up on frontline communities. We're giving up on the people who are most vulnerable to this crisis, who had nothing to do with it. And it is, in fact, a position of massive privilege to be able to say, we should just give up and live with the consequences of global climate change. That's not what our colleagues in the global south are doing. That's not what frontline communities are doing. They are fighting even in the face of, like, you know, incredibly adverse odds and conditions. And to say this is just hopeless, there's nothing we can do, is actually a massive statement of privilege. And so I think we can hold these things, both of these things at once, right? The crisis is really bad. We're too late to avoid some of its worst impacts, but we can still fight. We can still try to make things better. We can still push for the revolution that we need. And in fact, the conditions for that, you know, hopefully the conditions for that becoming more likely will change as things get worse. We don't know, but that won't happen if we stop fighting, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And to some degree, you know, we've already at least seen that incipently. I mean, not just with the organizing here, but, you know, I think we don't talk about it enough like this. I'll give Christian Parenti some credit for pointing this out to me a couple of years ago. But I mean, you know, you look at Sudan and what happened in 2019. I mean, a lot of what's happening there is that people are being forced off their land because they can't grow food. They're going close to the Nile River. I know there's a lot going on there now, and we'll maybe talk about that later in the show, but, you know, millions of people took to the streets, took their own sort of lives into their own hands. Egypt, obviously, probably, at least in my opinion, didn't go exactly the way, but similar thing, climate change effects and people coming out. And I think we're seeing, you know, whether we're talking about Minnesota, whether we're talking about Africa, whether we're talking about Latin America, that even when it's sort of a slightly delayed reaction, like people might not be saying, we're doing this because of climate change, the sort of deeper conditions it's nested in, we are seeing sort of a new insurgent energy that I think has come from the consequences of this. And you know, I don't want to say it's a silver lining or be too hopeful about it, but I do think that it is something that people can sink their teeth into, Brandon, in terms of what's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also a lot of dangers, you know, with what you were just talking about, and with Christian Parenti's work. It makes me think about climate-induced migration, which is an issue that a lot of the activist community is starting to pay more attention to. That's going to be a massive phenomenon in the coming decades, right? We know that. All the research is telling us that. The estimates of the numbers of people displaced range wildly from tens of millions to like literally a billion, right? Just no one knows. But it's going to be huge, and we have to be ready for that. And we have to be ready with a response that is not xenophobic, that is not national security based, that is not eco-fascist, right? Because that's going to be the default, especially in, I mean, I think Europe is already a sort of cautionary tale of this. And obviously we see a lot of those trends in the United States already. But I can't remember if I said this on your show last week, but, you know, we have to be prepared with a sort of narrative of shared humanity, and that we're all in this together, and that we have to tackle this problem through global solidarity rather than through some nationalistic exercise where we're militarizing our borders in response to the climate crisis.
And it really is, you know, that narrative that you're talking about, that sort of like that narrative fight, where you have the sort of eco-fascist ideas versus basically like just like what you talked about, a common humanity, is so important right now, because you also have these big like philanthropic foundations run by people like Bill Gates and others who are really just like buying up real estate around the world, pushing these crazy ideas that, when you think about it, what they're actually talking about, like they talk about population control. They don't really say it like that, but that's kind of what they mean. They talk about this thing called half Earth. There's really nasty ideas by like our sort of like billionaire overlord class about how to deal with climate change. And it really is to just ramp up imperialism, to just create this really parasitic situation that already exists to a more extreme degree, where you have these rich global north countries that seem to really still think that they'll be insulated from the worst impacts of climate change, because maybe they don't think they're being impacted as much, or that they can insulate themselves with like better infrastructure, but that they could just like a huge part of humanity in the global south will just have to live with the consequences behind these big walls and we'll just continue to prosper. And I mean, it's just a joke that they think that that's how we can live, but also it's really dangerous because people do fall for this. And also, you guys were talking about that earlier, like the fact that there is this narrative, especially it remains a narrative, I think, in the corporate media. And I don't think it's accidental, this idea that we can't do anything to change it. It's done. You have to accept that there's going to be catastrophic climate change. And that too is really beneficial for the ruling class, because what better than to have people just accept it and not do anything to push back, right? So how do we deal with that challenge? How do we deal with that challenge of apathy? Because when it comes to this issue, it does seem like when you look around, of course, there's incredible organizing taking place, and I don't want to take away from that. But there also is this kind of people just, shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, the media told me there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, so I mean, two things. I think what you said about apathy actually goes hand in hand with the solutions that the billionaires are offering us, because people are like, oh, we can't change society, like that's crazy. But maybe these billionaires have some techno fix, right? Maybe there's some scientific discovery that we'll come up with, or some geoengineering technique, so that we can actually just fix this problem without upending the status quo, right? That's what the billionaires want. That's what all their money is driving towards. And so the apathy serves that agenda, right? And I think to counter that apathy, I mean, it's a failure of imagination, right? A few years ago, I was doing some work on renewable energy in the global South. And for so many people, the vision of a transition to a renewable energy economy looks a whole hell of a lot like our existing energy economy, except the big corporations are running centralized solar plants instead of coal-fired power plants, right? And that's not how it needs to be, right? That's not how it should be. Like, the nature of solar energy is that it can be and should be controlled by everyone, right? And so we were pushing this model of decentralized, community-controlled renewable energy. And it was like mind-blowing for some people, because they're like, oh, you mean the transition isn't just swapping out one technology for another? It's like a whole different way of structuring power and structuring control. Yeah, but that's not how we are used to thinking, right? And so there's this thing about transforming people's imagination so that we can imagine what's possible that we're just, I just think we're not good at as a society. And I think one of the most effective interventions from a few years ago was actually that video from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where it was like, imagine a future, right? And it's like that sort of exercise that we need more of. It's not enough on its own, obviously. But I think that's got to be a starting point, because right now people are so limited by what they think is possible that we can't even have the kinds of conversations we need to be having.
No, I think that's such a good point. I was thinking about this morning, checking in on the South African election, where, I don't know how many people are paying attention to that, but one of the biggest issues by far is electricity. The power was out today, and it's worse now because they say they're going to keep the power on all day during election day, so they're doing whatever they can. But, it's I don't want to make too many wild commentaries on the political parties of South Africa. I don't live there, but I mean, it is just stunning to me, the sort of lack of, they say, well, there's nothing we can really do about it. It is what it is, the infrastructure, the power lines, it's going to take us 35 years to fix it. While at the same time, they're saying how, everyone, many people, even in the shanty towns, are having to get solar panels just to survive. And there's no rethinking or thoughts of rethinking the grid, rethinking spatial orientation. And when you think like that, then yeah, there really is nothing you can do. And people are in fact condemned to live in the dark. But that's just such a defeative statement on so many levels. But it does bring me to another point that we've also sort of been sort of glancing on here that I think is important, Brandon, and that is the impacts on the global South. I mean, I think that maybe people hear a lot about it, but really when we look at sort of historic emissions, people who were really paying for a problem that they, by and large, did not cause, and then who are now being told, well, listen, you can't have any of the good things we have because your carbon footprint will go up. I mean, it does seem that there is sort of like a reparatory justice element to this conversation as well.
Yeah, and frankly, that's why the COP and the UN climate negotiations is important, It's really the only space to have those kinds of conversations in a space that is at least formally democratic. Now, obviously, there's geopolitics at play. There's dirty tricks that wealthy countries play behind closed doors all the time, but it's a formally democratic space, and developing countries can raise those kinds of concerns, questions about reparations, even if they don't use that language. The language is loss and damage in the UN negotiations. And those are big demands. A big priority for developing countries at this year's negotiations is loss and damage finance. We've set up these sort of kind of centers to think about loss and damage and how climate impacts are affecting developing countries and how they can be supported in dealing with those. And there's no money attached to any of that. So now they're saying, look, we need a financial mechanism for this. We need to be able to access resources to deal with loss and damage from climate impacts when we had nothing to do with causing the problem. So not surprisingly, the US and other wealthy countries don't really want to talk about it. It was a fight just to get that on the agenda. And the balance of forces is very much against having an outcome that is favorable for developing countries, but we got to fight, right? That's what that space is supposed to be for, and we need to, we can't cede it. I will say that, one thing I want to get ahead of in the narrative at these negotiations, really at all climate negotiations, is US-China kind of stuff, right? China just today announced its new nationally determined contribution or sort of climate action plan that it submits to the UN. China is always the scapegoat in the US. We like to say China's not doing enough. And so in order to be competitive in the global economy, we can't go beyond what China is willing to do. Well, according to our analysis, China is actually roughly doing its fair share of climate action, right? Using that same analysis that I mentioned earlier in the show. That's not to say that more isn't needed from China. China is currently a very large emitter, although a lot of those emissions are embedded in the production of goods for the Western world. And China also has a massive, development and poverty alleviation problem still. So they've got a ways to go, but they're roughly doing their fair share, according to our analysis, relative to, say, the United States, which is pledging 4 or 5 times less than what we need to be doing. And so, I just want to make sure, I know you've talked about this on your show before, but it's just too easy for US politicians to go after China as a scapegoat. And the picture is significantly more complicated than that. And even when we managed to come up with a bilateral deal with China, like before we negotiated the Paris Agreement, the Obama administration did a lot of outreach to China and announced this US-China bilateral deal. And then all of a sudden we started scapegoating India, right? We're saying, oh, look at this other country that has a whole lot of people and is emitting a lot, right? I mean, it's just absurd. There's so many ways for US politicians to try to deflect blame. And we got to call that out for what it is.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you making that point. I think it was the Friends of the Earth letter about this issue that I thought phrased it very well, that, well, I'm actually using my own phrasing, but sort of paraphrasing. This is really an era of global cooperation, and that on pretty much all the challenges facing us, of course, starting with climate, if we're not thinking about how we have shared frameworks and shared points of reference about how we move forward on this, it's all just sort of, whistling Dixie as we walk down the street. I mean, it really is, it's where we are in the 21st century, and I hope people, can grasp that. Well, Brandon, as always, I really appreciate, you joining us here on the show. Appreciate all the work you guys are doing at ActionAid USA. Definitely, I hope people check in and plug into the work that y'all are doing. And we'll just keep coming back to this because, as you said very correctly, we got to fight. So I will say the pleasure is all ours. Thanks for coming back with us second week in a row. Well, Rania, I'm glad we did something on the climate 2 weeks in a row. I'm glad Brandon was willing to come back 2 weeks in a row. We were nervous about asking him. We were like, oh man, we're asking people to keep coming back. But, people have to keep hearing this. I mean, I really do feel it's, you hear about it around COP26. You get the odd argument here and there. When there's a tragedy, you know, like the people who died very tragically here in the New York, New Jersey area when the big storm came a couple months ago, you hear a little bit about it then, but then it quickly falls out of the news. And I think you pointed this out earlier, Rania, vis-a-vis other points in the way that they can be covered in the news. It just sort of, it's almost as if the two sides are somewhat co-equal. And you get a lot of things about, oh, climate change is really bad, but then in the conversation around, let's say what's happening in the congressional bill, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're not gonna put in one of those paragraphs that the earth is gonna be destroyed by the decisions that Joe Manchin is making, and Kristen Sinema, and all the people who aren't saying anything but who agree with them, you know, Stephanie Murphy in the House and all these other people. But that is what's happening, and that is the impact of it. But if you don't report it like that, and you just kind of report it like it's a baseball game or something, one side's doing this, one side's doing that, I mean, how can people, you know, we blame people so much and say, how come people don't know this? But how are you supposed to be informed? People would say, if you read the New York Times every day, you should be informed. But they're not even making the most basic of connections between the actions of politicians and the outcomes for the earth, even though both things in different sections in the paper are in there.
Frankly, they're just like running cover for the people who are spoiling the bill, the important parts of it about climate. And no matter how much it gets sort of defanged, they're going to say the bill's still great, the bill's still great. But yeah, it's really unfortunate because I have to say, like, it's hard to escape that. It's hard to escape that feeling of doom, like there isn't anything you can do. And that's really what they want us to believe. Like, they want us to believe that there's nothing we can do. So I'm really glad that we are able to cover this topic. And I think it is the most important topic of our times. But I do, with the time we have left, Eugene, I do want to switch gears if you'll allow me to. I wanted to ask you a question.
Please.
You will,
well,
thank
hopefully
you.
I have an answer.
It's your pleasure to allow me to. So I do want to, but I mean, I know we don't have very much time left here, but I think it's an important topic that didn't get enough attention this week. And I think it's because a lot of people don't really understand what the framing of this should be. But some crazy stuff happened in Sudan this week, which recently had a change in government due to an uprising a couple of years ago. And then this week there was this military coup that took place. You covered it on the Punch Out, and you follow Sudan very closely. So I was wondering if you could give our audience a very brief overview of what took place in Sudan this week, why it's significant, and why it happened.
Yeah, very significant. And I believe a protester was just killed, I think, a few hours ago by security forces. The death toll there is rising. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe the way for people to put it in context, and what I've been telling folks, is this is basically part 2 of 2019, the uprising that happened there that toppled the long-running government, more or less led by Omar al-Bashir, who's essentially seized power. It's a little more complicated than that in 1989, and then more or less ruled with some different coalition partners until then. And this was a huge mass uprising of the people of Sudan. It was very progressive in many different ways. You had people like the Communist Party, professional organizations, all sorts of different people from really all kinds of backgrounds coming out and saying that we have to make a change. The Bashir government, which I won't get too deep into it now, but let's just suffice it to say it wasn't taking care of people's basic social and economic needs in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, I think also sort of hypocritically used as sort of an element of anti-imperialism to cover for that. Obviously, you know, for many years, they were big supporters of the Palestinian cause, and that, you know, we'll get to that, plays a big role in this, and it plays a big role in what's happening right now. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to recognize that they were not doing what people needed, and I think that that is why they were forced out. And similar to what we saw in Tunisia, what we've seen in Egypt, what we've seen all around the world, quite frankly, of mass uprisings of people who are just sick and tired of being sick and tired. So what happens is this huge protest movement starts to rise up. And so some elements of the military that played a big role in the Bashir government decided to switch sides. And they were like, all right, well, we ain't gonna make it, so we better switch sides. And they were able to make some unity with some elements of the protest movement, but not all. The protest movement was under the umbrella of the Forces of Freedom and Change, so-called civilian coalition. So some of those elements, some elements of the military that turned sides in the government, they came together and they said, they mounted a coup essentially and said, we're gonna be the new government, we're gonna have a more or less, let's just call it half civilian, half military government, and that government is going to try to bring stability in the country and pave the way for elections in 2023. Now, pretty much since that moment in 2019, this has all been very controversial. There's a lot of different pieces, but real quick. So you basically have three sides to this fight. You've got the Forces for Freedom and Change that are affiliated with the civilian side of this so-called temporary government. Then you have the military and their supporters, non-military supporters, who are also calling themselves the Forces for Freedom and Change. So there's a split there. So it's a little confusing, that are on the other side, blaming each other. The civilian side is saying the reason everything is not going the way you want, and things are definitely going very badly in Sudan. There's been huge inflation that's going on. It's very difficult for people to eat, very difficult for people to get medicines. Maybe a good way for people to put this in context. There is a government program that's supposed to help with cost. It's $5 a month, and that is not enough money for basic medicines or basic food. So even with the addition of assistance from the government, many millions of people struggling to have food, medicine, shelter, all of that, and it's only getting worse because prices are continuing to rise. So you had the civilian side of the government saying, it's not our fault, we didn't do anything, it's really just the military, they're not following through, and they really just want to seize power. They're not interested in empowering the people and giving them the levers of a true democratic small d reality where they could determine the direction of their own country. Then you had the military forces and their supporters who were like, no, it's actually the civilian side of the government that's responsible for everything, and they need to reshuffle the cabinet. So that was sort of the two sides of it in the government. And then you have a third set of forces, which consist of the people who were central to the protest movement, but didn't agree with this new government being set up at all. That's the Sudanese Communist Party and various professional associations of, doctors, dentists, people like that who play a big role in the mobilizations, as well as something called resistance committees that represent different groups of people. And pretty much from Jump Street, they said this whole thing is a setup. Neither of these sides really are interested in what the underlying reality of the revolution is, which is to improve the social and economic conditions of people in the country and give them a role in their own society and empower them. And that ultimately they just want to rearrange the deck chairs of the previous system, and under the guise of democracy, they want to say, that they're, under the guise of democracy, they want to maintain power and basically be just a new Bashir and his friends. So those forces have been very much central to the anti-coup protests that are happening right now, that are being brutally suppressed by the military government. They're shooting people, they're beating people, they're arresting activists, and it really all comes down, and this is why I said it's really part 2 of 2019, to is there just going to be a rearranging of the deck chairs among elites, or is there going to be a deeper, more thoroughgoing transition? A lot of people in the streets want a deeper, more thoroughgoing transition, but there are a lot of people in the high places that want to do whatever they can to prevent that. Some of those people who want to prevent that are on the side of the protests right now. Some of the people who support the old regime are on the side of the protests right now. Some of the people who support the old regime are on the side of the military right now. So you've got a lot of different elite forces that want an Egypt situation. They want to use the anger of the masses to put themselves into power, and then when the immediate post-revolutionary government doesn't work out, then they use the anger of the masses again to put themselves in power under the guise of righting the wrongs of those who derailed the revolution. And then you have those on the streets who are saying, all y'all are fraudulent, and we want to push this thing to its conclusion, give people power, control, and a different and much better reality in terms of what's going on. So that's the basic situation you have there. There are a lot of different pieces to this. Sudan was under many, many sanctions, principally because of its support for the Palestinian people. There were other issues it was allegedly about, Darfur and things like that. Wasn't really about that. And so in order to get out from under this, the government that came in 2019, they normalized relations with Israel in order to get access to international funds and under sanctions. And they've also been playing a very strong role in support of the TPLF in Ethiopia, and they've really been kind of the cat's paw of the US and Egypt in terms of putting pressure on Ethiopia around the situation there in northern Ethiopia. So the government itself took quite a turn to the imperialist lane, if you will, and so that's also a part of this and also an element of this. There's much more that could be said. What is the role of the United States? I know many people are asking themselves that. That's not really clear to me. I think there are a number of people who are trying to make it about, the military is good or something and against the United States. That's not true. They're both for the United States. They both were complicit in moving against the Palestinian people. And in fact, the military government now, de facto government, allegedly told Jeffrey Feltman, the U.S. envoy to the region, that they were going to do this. So I don't know if they were against the United States, I don't know why they would be meeting with them and saying, hey, by the way, help us out because we're going to take power. So anyway, long story short, you have people in Sudan trying to push forward a movement for transformative change in their country and to try to push aside all the different forces that have been trying to derail that real powerful thrust that has come since 2019.
That was an incredible, Sudan in 5 minutes kind of moment. That was really, thank you. I think a lot of people are a little bit confused about what's going on. And this is more just a comment than a question, because I don't think we have time to really delve into it too much now. But I think it's something to reflect on, is when I look at, I don't know Sudan that well. I won't purport to know, but based on what you're saying and what I've read about the movement there in 2019 that has continued, and I look at places like Lebanon, which also actually had somewhat of an uprising in 2019. And I look at other places like Tunisia, like Egypt, like Syria, all these places that have these uprisings. They keep failing in many ways. And I think it's a good question. I don't think they're all the same, or, we should be suggesting they're all the same, or putting a blanket explanation. But all around the world, we continue to see an uprising and anger against really archaic systems that just aren't working. But the uprisings aren't as transformational as they want to be. And I think it's a good question to ask why, because you're not going to get it right until you figure out why. And I see a lot of similar failures over and over again. And I don't think there's one answer to that. But I do see over and over, especially on this side of the world, just, a failure to have a cohesive, transformational, revolutionary idea that's organized. And I know it's hard to do that in countries where maybe that organizing hasn't been happening for various reasons. But it's certainly something to reflect on. It's because it's frustrating. It's frustrating. These systems do need to change. And every time there is some hope that they might, it gets smashed in some way or another.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I mean, to stick with the Sudanese example, I mean, and not to keep name checking them, but I do think they're playing an important role and doing a great job. I mean, this is the point the Sudanese Communist Party was making, and that I think many people with similar politics have made. It's all about really the understanding of the state. And the reality is, in many of these countries, the governments are so dictatorial that any change in terms of access to elections, freedom of the press, the ability to protest, all these other things, I mean, these are huge changes in these countries. I mean, you think about Egypt under the former president there, and right now, quite frankly, under al-Sisi. You think about, al-Bashir. You think about Ben Ali in Tunisia. And I think that it plays a role that can be very disorienting, because you can have these huge, massive changes in your society for the better in many cases. And so it is revolutionary in many ways, and it has this feeling of wow, we've done so much. But it doesn't change the basic nature of the state, the elites, the rich who ultimately control it. And as we see in most of these countries, we're seeing it again right now in Tunisia with the attempts to roll back what's happening there, is as long as the state, as long as the government continues to be controlled by elites, as long as the rich and the powerful and the internationally connected are able to manipulate things behind the scenes to their desire, elections, freedom of the press, all of that can only go but so far. We see that in the United States. We see that in Europe, where there are elections, there's freedom of the press. I mentioned South Africa earlier, similar thing, vibrant protest culture in places like that. And yet and still, you still see the entrenched power of people setting clear limits on what's possible. And I think that's what is really missing in a lot of this, is a discourse that revolution is not just dramatic change. Even if it's dramatic change for the better, it's a change in power relations. And those who are the humble people who are making up the protest movements in the street have to be able to take power in their own hands. And what power means isn't just getting elected to office, it's the ability to exclude those who are going to try to manipulate things behind the scenes to make sure that their power is maintained. So I mean, it's a longer question about that, but I think the role of the state is all important. The state is not neutral. It's an instrument of class power, and the class can mutate. They can be authoritarian, they can be democratic, they can be somewhere in between. Like the rich people, the elites, they can do all of that. So it's really not just clearly about the form, it's also about the content. And I think that's exactly what's happening in Sudan, and that's exactly what a lot of the people who've been criticizing both sides of the government, the ones that are overthrown and the military that's in power now, have been trying to make. Like, if we really want to make a change, we need to fully with the broom sweep out all these elites and bring the humble people who are making up this protest movement into some serious form of control.
And I think one of the best manipulators, when you talk about the manipulations behind the scenes, is, and I don't know if this is the case in Sudan, but I imagine it is, because there is this sort of cookie cutter situation that you see happening in a lot of these developing countries. And I see it in Lebanon. And it was in Syria, and it was in Egypt, and it was in all of these countries, is that when there is an upsurge in anger at a system, there is such a Western funded NGO kind of complex that is infiltrated civil society to try to affect the discourse and to try to push it in a direction that doesn't actually transform the power relations that you're talking about. So it's like this agenda that ends up taking over the media sphere and being the most projected voice. I saw it happen in Lebanon, that ends up just aligning itself in discourse with the US or with Western powers. And across the Middle East, we saw the Arab Spring take a nasty turn because of that kind of in the background manipulation of any grievances. And so it's really also a question of sovereignty, because it's like, how can you make transformational change when these massive outside powers always try to manipulate it to their advantage? And so it's incredibly frustrating. And this is one of the reasons why, I mean, I think it's so important to recognize why we as Americans, at least, should be, we should be opposing imperialism, because it actually makes it more difficult for people in other countries to have uprisings and to change their own systems. Because we end up so many times, our government ends up being the one that plays such a dramatic role and standing in the way and making it impossible for things to really change in a real way, and in many cases, making it worse.
Yeah,
That's the last thing I'll say about it.
I think that's good. I couldn't have said that better. I think maybe that's a good note to even end the show on, because I don't even want to take away from that, because I think that's an important concept. And of course, it's a lot of what we're bringing to the table here, and all of our great guests, it's such a pleasure to have on, are also bringing to the table. Nevertheless, Rania, it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be alongside you here. And of course, people can go to patreon.com. Thank you for that, Juan. I see you there. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. And you can become a patron, help us push forward all the work that we're doing here, help us bring on all the great guests, all the new shows. You see, we're doing a lot, we're working a lot. We're trying to bring you everything we can to, make this complicated world as easy to understand as possible, and to make the routes to action very clear. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. At our website, breakthroughnews.org, you can also make one-time donations. There's also a link in our bio and social media at BT Newsroom on all your social media platforms. So thanks again to everyone for watching, participating in any way, shape, or form. We really, really appreciate you. Rania, it was great to be alongside you here once again.
Pleasure was all mine, Eugene.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Nevertheless, we'll see you all next week.